Welcome, everybody. This is Beyond Google Classroom. This is our Digital Instruction Network series, the last one in September. I'm Allison Rogers, Instructional Tech at Clinton County RESA, and I am joined today by Christy Lobdell from Eaton RESA and Laura Foreback, Science Teacher at DeWitt. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. And thanks to our special guest, Laura, for giving up her time today to share her expertise and all the cool applications she's doing with Google Classroom. Some of you may have remembered her awesome sessions at the TI4E conference back in August, and it was so well received that we begged her to come join us here today. So thanks, Laura, for all of your time and awesome ideas. So what we're going to be covering today is not just an how-to of Google Classroom. I think at this point in the year, everyone's familiar and comfortable with navigating Classroom as we're approaching October. But we're going to kind of focus more on the now what. How do we build in applications that really enhance learning and improve the online learning experience for students? And so with that, we are going to first talk about an analogy that we came up with about Google Classroom. And then Laura's going to dig in and tell us about some synchronous and asynchronous learning tools that she uses day to day, and along those lines with specific examples. And she's going to talk about kind of her process as she decides to use which tools and for what purposes, the pros, the cons, that kind of stuff. So lots of real life applicable examples that I think everybody who's a teacher right now will appreciate. So, and then if we have time at the end, we'll review just a couple of the updates from Classroom and then a few tips and tricks. Classroom is really kind of it's the house in which, or the platform in which all of our content lives, right? It's almost our framework, our structure, and within that structure, we build in specific pieces to enhance learning. So our analogy is that Google Classroom is our house, and we're building each room, or we are maybe making renovations to our room as we include different add-ons and applications and resources and tools. We talked about how, going further into the analogy, we might want to build doorways or stairs to scaffold our learning to get to that next tool or resource for application or higher level thinking. Some of our houses might be very complex, right? We might have the expertise to do it ourselves. We might have a little bit more knowledge and foundational understanding of how to, do the plumbing and how to build in fancy electricity. And some of us might say, I'm more of a minimalist, or I'm not super handy, but I have a basic foundation of what needs to be in a house. So I'm going to stick with maybe a smaller house or more simplistic things. So we really kind of went down this rabbit hole of what this analogy could look like with Google Classroom. We also talked about not just renovating and improving your house, but also maintaining your house, right? So sometimes you might have a leaky roof, right? That could be like a tool that you're using that perhaps isn't working quite the way you want it to in an online learning environment. So what are some patches we could put in to replace that leaky roof, if you will? So we could go on and go down this rabbit hole of this analogy, but we really wanted to focus on, Google Classroom is just the house that stores all of the cool applications that Laura is going to speak about. So,
we're all as teachers being asked to use this platform, and we all have a house or a place that we live in. None of our homes are identical to the other. We build our home or renovate our home or set up our home in a way that works for us, in a way that makes sense for us and our family and our students and our classroom. So what your neighbor teacher is doing doesn't have to be exactly what you're doing. So we're hoping that through this presentation, you will find some things that resonate well with you, that can fit well within your home or your Google Classroom.
And picking up on that neighbor idea, like your team or your other teachers in your building are your neighborhood. From a student's perspective, they're like visiting all these different homes, visiting all these different classrooms. So what features of your neighborhood need to be the same for students, and what can be individualized? Yes, like trick-or-treating.
We just wanted to start with just a quick reflection from the group here. And, you know, the term synchronous and the term asynchronous are terms that we kind of just learned when we got into this whole remote learning platform. But we were doing these things before, in the before times, as Laura has coined the term. Before school was dismissed back in March, we were doing synchronous and asynchronous activities. So let's use frames 1 and 2 to kind of think back to the before times. What were we doing that would be considered a synchronous activity that you and your class are all doing together at the same time? And then think of some other examples on frame 2 of things that maybe in your classroom you were doing that would fall along the lines of asynchronous. Your students were maybe doing something different than what you were doing in the classroom. Maybe you sent them on a task in a small group or something at their desk to work on by themselves. It looks like we've already got some fun activities here of synchronous learning activities, tools, or strategies. Using a think, pair, share routine. That's a great idea of something that we would do synchronously within our classroom to enhance the conversation and discussion that occurs in your room. Labs, of course, we're all having to be in the same room to do a science lab or a hands-on activity. Awesome. Yeah, okay, I didn't even think of that. Even a small group table collaboration is synchronous. It might not be with your whole class, but if you are present with that small group and you guys are collaborating on a topic and that's happening in the moment with the teacher, that's considered synchronous. Kahoot, a good one, pulling in some tech tools into synchronous learning, some writing activities, Go Math whole lessons. So as we are teaching the actual lesson for your math objective that day, that's occurring synchronously. I'm going to hop over here to asynchronous learning activities. Stations was one that we came up with too, where we thought, you know, what a powerful asynchronous activity we had back then in the before times when we were able to set up stations within our classroom for students to rotate through. A gallery walk, partner review activity. And at first, when we first had this discussion, we thought, well, asynchronous meant homework. We're sending home homework, and that's the asynchronous task. But as we dug a little deeper, we thought, no, we're doing asynchronous learning activities all the time in the traditional classroom, in the before times, as we were calling it.
One of the things that I wanted to share with everyone today was kind of just where my brain was as a teacher. So in our school, we are right smack dab in the middle of our transition from fully remote learning, which we've been doing for the last 5 weeks, to hybrid, which we just started on Monday. So we currently have half of our students attending on Monday and Tuesday, and then the other half will come see us Thursday and Friday, while the other half works at home asynchronously. We do have some sections within each of our grades that are staying fully remote until the end of the trimester at least. So we've kind of got a lot going on right now, and there's a lot of different modes of instruction happening. So as I was thinking about like beyond Google Classroom and what does that mean, my brain automatically went to like how I'm teaching and how I need to be teaching next week. And next month feels far away, but it's really not that far away. How do I need to be teaching a month from now? So I kind of just organized my favorite tools into how I've been using them during my fully remote time. So this little Venn diagram, love the Venn diagrams, right? This Venn diagram shows some of my favorite tech tools that I've been using beyond Google Classroom. in terms of synchronous and asynchronous activity. At our school, we had synchronous time with our students each day, except for Wednesdays, which were reserved for asynchronous time. So even within our remote only, we had a mix of instructional models. And now that we're hybrid, we're keeping some of that and changing some of that. So I wanted to kind of think through what I've been doing and why I've been doing it and how I've been doing it. And so these are some of my favorites. These are not all of the things in the world, right? And you might not like or use a specific one, but these were just some of the things I had tried out in my remote only phase of teaching. So under synchronous, I've listed whiteboard Phi, which is totally a leaky roof in my house. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that is for sure a leaky roof. And all the Meet updates, we are a Google Meet school. So if you are also using Google Suite, then these Meet updates are some seriously cool renovations that have happened recently, including breakout rooms. On the asynchronous side, forms, I put a little asterisk by because that's one of those ones that slides in and out, although I've tended towards the asynchronous use of it, so I put it there. Edpuzzle and Flipgrid and Cami and Wiser.me, these are all things that I tend towards asynchronous. But then in the middle, this is where I think my best teacher thinking was happening. In the middle here are all the things that can go either direction, depending on your needs and depending on your students and depending on your topic. So here are some questions that I like to ask myself as I'm considering which tool I want to use. The things I try to ask myself, and I admit I am not always great about all of these, and sometimes I don't know the answers, but you charge ahead anyway because you're just not sure what you're going to get and they surprise you. So there's some exploration involved with these questions too, but I try to think about what kind of data I'm collecting from my students in whatever task we're doing. Most of the time that's formative, right? But sometimes you're gonna need some summative data. And what am I using it for? Most of the time the answer is to plan the next piece of instruction, but not always. So you gotta think about what you need and why you need it. And then, is this the right time to use this tool with the students? Like, are they going to be receptive to it? Are they going to be able to do it? Which is kind of connected to this next question. Is it worth the cost of introducing a new tool? Because that always comes with a cost, and sometimes that's pretty steep. So if it's a tool that's difficult or brand new to them or tricky in some way, is it worth that cost to get the results that I want? Like, is that data worth it? So that's a tough question to answer. And sometimes you don't know till you're in the thick of it if it was worth it or not. Sometimes you just go with your gut and hope for the best on that cost benefit analysis. So those are the things I kind of think about as I'm doing it. So here are a couple synchronous examples to kind of show you what I mean by that. So during synchronous instruction, my general goal, at least during the remote only phase, and this is shifting a little bit under me as we move to hybrid, but my general goal for synchronous remote instruction is student engagement, right? And that means like connecting with kids and building the relationships, but also the content formative assessment piece. Like, I need to get to know them. I need to understand how they tick. I need to figure out how they're making sense out of this content, because I need to know where the gaps are, right? Especially this year, that's super important to try to figure out what we're all working with here. So those are my main goals of these synchronous tools. And of course, there's always challenges with synchronous learning. And the main challenge that I found during remote only teaching time was the equity issue that we're all struggling with. And that was especially true with my leaky roof. So the thing I wanted to share with you about my leaky roof, my biggest one so far, my biggest leak was Whiteboard Phi. This is a pretty fun tool if you've tried it out. It's a tool that allows you to give each kid an individual whiteboard. Like, that's a staple in my in-person classroom, having an individual whiteboard for kids to write on and hold up. But there's not a great way to do that when they're at home if they don't have a whiteboard. So like I watch my own kid with her math lessons, like having a little whiteboard and holding it up, and that's cool to see the little faces holding up their boards on the Google Meet. But that's a pretty public thing. Like when the kids all have their cameras on and they're holding up their whiteboards, like that's your answer plastered on the screen for everybody in your class to see. And so I was struggling with that a little bit as a middle school teacher. Like kids are already a little shy about their cameras on in middle school. It's a little trickier to get them to engage with conversation, especially at first. So I didn't want like a whiteboard in your face, everybody look at my answer. I wanted something a little more private. So Whiteboard 5 was really cool for that because each kid can see my whiteboard as the teacher and they can see their own whiteboard and I can watch them writing on or typing on their whiteboard as we're in the meet together. So I was super pumped, like this is it, I found it, this is the perfect solution. But it was totally leaky because some kids just lagged so much that I couldn't see what they knew. Like they got frustrated enough that they actually unmuted and spoke, which you know is a big deal if you know middle schoolers. So it worked really, really well for like 80% of my kids. And it didn't work at all for 20%. And that is not a good enough payback for me to keep using it. So I'm looking for alternatives, but now that we're moving into hybrid, it might not be worth as much of an investment. Whiteboard.chat is another one that I've heard a lot of people using that's very similar. So if you're still in a remote situation, I would recommend checking out Whiteboard.chat. It seems to do the same thing with less of the lagging issue. But it's certainly worth exploring because it gives you that private moment with a student that you don't get by holding up a whiteboard in a meet. And the thing that I was super excited about it for, and like my biggest disappointment that it was a leaky roof situation, is because I really wanted to use it for like how they're doing. So like you can kind of be a little bit private with your thumb in a classroom. Like it's not super public, but it's a little public in person. With Whiteboard 5, I was pumped because I was going to have them just scribble or draw a shape that was red, yellow, or green. Like I don't get it, I need help, or I'm doing okay, or yes, totally have it. And so this was like my big, yes, this is perfect. They can give me a private message because you can't private message in Google Meet, right? Like you can in Zoom. So I was really pumped about it. And so that was kind of a disappointment for me to run into, but you keep moving, right? The other thing on this slide that I wanted to talk just a little bit about were the updates in Meet. So these have been rolling out slowly if you're a G Suite school. It sounds like, at least like in the bloggy things that I follow, that most people are getting them by now. And polls and breakout rooms are super helpful. They're not perfect, right? Like they have their pros and cons, but these are super great at those goals for synchronous remote, the student engagement, way higher in breakout rooms and polls. Polls are a quick and easy way to get a vibe for how students are doing. So way up on the student engagement, which helps foster that connection and relationship building, and super helpful for formative assessment too if you've got a quick question or two you're interested in. So there's that. The next slide shows an example of how I used Pear Deck as a synchronous tool. So Pear Deck is, it could be synchronous or asynchronous. I have used it mostly synchronously just to kind of engage kids with slideshows a little bit more. So kind of those exit ticket kinds of questions, like if I was presenting a lesson in the classroom, those questions that I would naturally ask, and like, how we doing here, you know, those questions I would insert into my lesson to get a feel for how they're doing, are really easy to insert with Pear Deck. So this is an example of a quiz that I tried, and I'm calling it Forma Summa, I didn't even say it right, it's my own word, I didn't say it right. Forma summative, yeah, assessment. Like, so I was trying to do something a little more summative, like they should know the answer by now, but of course it's not really fair because internet, right? It's not the same for everybody, and kids get kicked off and dropped all the time. So you can't do like a great objective summative assessment in a Google Meet. But I also kind of want to put a little more pressure on because I think they should know it by now. So I did a pear deck with questions that like they were just vocabulary words. So real basic, real low skill level thinking here. But just to kind of check in, like, do you really know what we're talking about? And then they only had a certain amount of time and I could see answers popping up, right? So I could limit the time to try to make it a little more of a challenge, but still not, like it doesn't achieve that summative assessment level. So that was a synchronous tool that I thought was kind of helpful. It almost made it like a game, you know, it made it a little more like time sensitive. It wasn't as fun as quizzes or Kahoot, but it still had that element of answer quick. Yeah, Marianne's talking about Whiteboard Fi and the issues. There's some really cool things about it, and it can work. Like it has great potential. I think just if you have a kid with a slow internet connection, it's tricky. So I don't know.
Did you have problems every time you tried it?
I did, and it was different kids that had the problems. It wasn't always like just the same one or two. It was always a chunk. But the ones that were doing it, it was working really well. So I don't know. I just wouldn't put a high stakes piece of information I was trying to gather on that. But if it's something where they could, you know, put it in the chat instead or something like that, it worked out pretty well. All right, switching over to asynchronous. So like the other side of my Venn diagram there. With the remote, the fully remote online learning, my goal for asynchronous time was mostly about student exploration, processing new information, and then like using that information, right? Creating performance assessments, things like that. So I'm a science teacher, so like the 5E model, right? Like they're gonna engage, they're gonna explore. And then I want them doing something, right? Like I want that application. So whereas the synchronous time, I might get some really good higher level thinking in terms of discussion and interaction with each other. In the asynchronous time, I'm going to get those higher level thinking skills through whatever tool I'm choosing, right? So you want to think about what you want your kids thinking about and how you want them showing this new knowledge or their application of that new knowledge. Of course, equity challenges still exist, like they don't just disappear because now kids have a little more time, but since you're not trying to run video in a meet and you're not limited to the clock, they're slightly ameliorated, right? Like if kids can work. We have a lot of kids that if they're running a meet, like that's all their Chromebook can handle. Like they're just in that meet. It's really hard for them to work on a slideshow and run a meet, or it's really hard for them to use a different tool and be in the meet at the same time. So that synchronous kind of limits you in terms of what tool. But if they're on their own and working at their own pace or on their own time, that becomes less of an issue. So it doesn't go away, but it's a little better. So some of my favorite ones here are Edpuzzle, of course. Edpuzzle is super awesome. And shout out to our math department around here. They've been using Edpuzzle in some really cool ways. So they're basically like flipping, not everybody, but a lot of our teachers are flipping their instruction almost entirely so that kids are getting the instruction through the Edpuzzle video. They're seeing the example, they're getting the mini lecture, they're getting the new content through the Edpuzzle video that the teacher has created and uploaded. And then the questions on Edpuzzle serve as like the exit tickets. So the kids can kind of check themselves through the lesson, and then your synchronous time can just be devoted to questions and answers and working through problems together. So it's working really, really well for that. And they've done some really creative things with assessments through Edpuzzle too. One of our awesome high school teachers and I were talking, and she made a super cool video where she did some problems, but she made mistakes. So she made an Edpuzzle video, made the mistakes that are common errors for kids, and then their assessment that she graded them summatively on, because this was at the end, was find my mistake. Like, what did I do wrong and what should I have done? So there's a clever way to like get that non-Googleable answer, right? Like that's something we're all struggling with in terms of assessment, is how are we really getting a good read on what kids know? And I know math teachers that I've been talking to are particularly stressed about this, like how do I get them to just not copy? And so this I thought was a really clever way. So she made some unique errors and then shipped those out to different groups of kids so that they probably could talk about it, but at least in the moment they had to decide what was the mistake. So you can get pretty creative with some of these tools. So I really liked that example from Edpuzzle. I'm loving Flipgrid right now. I use Flipgrid a lot. The next slide shows just an image. I'd love to show you the whole video, but this particular student is talking and her face is in it. So this is just a still from her video. But right now, this week, my students are making Rube Goldberg machines because we are learning about potential and kinetic energy and energy transformations. And so she is demonstrating right there. She's got a paper airplane that comes in on that string. You can kind of see the string in front of the clock there at an angle. So her paper airplane comes in and it hits the dominoes and it knocks the ball off the edge of the mantle and it flips a little thing down on the bottom to land in a basket and whatever. And she's walking through all that. And this is a really fun way for me to have that non-Googleable formal assessment, summative assessment, because this is my grade for the standard here. Is our students able to explain to me the energy transformations? Are they demonstrating it appropriately? Are they using the good vocabulary that I want them to use? And so this is a great asynchronous assessment piece because now I can watch their videos and hear them talking to me, but we're safe. We're not in the same room together. So this is working out really well for me. I know that's not a super unique or stellar example, but that's how I'm using it this week. And it's working out really well. It's given me great read on the kids and where they are. And then they can have some fun too, because they like to do projects like that. Let's see, what else on this slide? Any other, oh, the next slide, Christy, has a couple examples of some other things. So asynchronous use of forms, I tend towards asynchronous because if I'm choosing a form, like a Google form versus Go Formative, or just formative, I've heard it called both ways, I don't know. I tend to use a Google form if I want that data, if I want my answers in a spreadsheet that I'm going to be able to manipulate. So if I want to be able to sort my students' answers, if I'm going to be grouping them by their answers, if I'm going to be looking at like how close are we on a specific standard, but I want some like graphing power, I'm going to use a form for that as opposed to formative. But formative does have some pretty good graphs. So I think you could argue that one both ways. I give my students a 5 for Friday form. Every Friday I ask them 5 questions. It tends to be 2 like social emotional kinds of questions, like check-in things, 1 procedural kind of question and 2 content questions. I vary that up a little bit. It's not always the same, but I try to get a feel for where they're at, and then I also try to get a little content knowledge in there too. And then a fun thing I did recently was I reversed 5 for Friday, and it was their job to ask me 5 questions. And then I've been answering those as we go along. But that was an example. The reverse 5 for Friday is an example of one where I really wanted to be able to sort, because I know a lot of kids are going to ask the same questions, right? They want to know what my favorite food is, and they want to know how many pets I have and what their names are and stuff like that. So I want to be able to manipulate and move that information around. So a spreadsheet is my best bet there. The thing I like about formative as opposed to Google Forms is that I can watch it in real time. And with a form, I can't see their answers till they hit submit on their Google form. But in formative, I can watch the answers rolling in as they're doing it. And then that other screenshot is just an example of a practice that I used with Cami. So the little image, I know you can't read it very well. The little image is a kid's handwriting on a worksheet. And we see this a lot in Google Classroom, right? But like they hold their paper weird, or it's wrinkly, or the lighting's not good and you can't read it. Cami is a nice way to give kids a little more kind of editing power, I guess. They can type text boxes, they can highlight, they can mark up text really well. So with older kids like our middle schoolers that are using reading strategies like talk to the text or marking up text, this can allow them to do that and allow the teacher to see their highlights and their comments and their thoughts on a reading passage without having to exchange paper, because exchanging paper is kind of a thing right now, right? We got to think about that. And so that thinking out loud that the language arts and the social studies teachers want to see on text can be done digitally instead of trying to hand papers back and forth. Okay, so that is a little bit about some asynchronous things that I like to do. I kind of already launched into the formative. On the next slide, I put some of those tools that I like to use in both directions. So I already said that formative I really like because I get that feedback immediately, like I can watch them taking it. So I really am loving that, and that has some pretty cool graphing power too. But if I want to manipulate, then I'm going to choose forms instead. Jamboard and Padlet likewise are super fun in a synchronous way, like we just used Jamboard to get ideas out and have a discussion. But I think the asynchronous use of tools like that is really cool too, because it gives you this really cool record of the thinking and the collaboration. So if kids are adding to that as you're going through a unit or through a week, or even just having them post some questions ahead of time to review synchronously, I think there's a lot of power in the asynchronous use of collaboration too. Just because you're not there at the same time on the Jamboard doesn't mean you can't share the ideas that you're having. And Google Slides, this is kind of my new trick. So before we had breakout rooms in Google Meet, Jamboard was a little bit sticky sometimes for groups. I would try to put like a group on each Jamboard, but like flipping through was a little tricky for me. I found that I really liked doing that in slides. I would assign each group a slide to work on within a slideshow. And then if you go to the grid view, like at the bottom, so not the edit mode, I don't remember what it's called. What's it called? Film strip view or something like that, right? On the side. If you go to the grid view, you can see each slide while the kids are working. So I can instantly see like, ooh, that group needs me right now, or this group is way off, or these two groups are okay. Whereas on Jamboard, you got to do a lot more clicking and you can't see them all together. So I really like slides as a synchronous tool, but then of course, slides is super powerful for asynchronous, kind of like Nearpod or Pear Deck. You can lay out your whole lesson for kids to work through at their own pace. Quizzes I put on there as well, because of course anything gamification is fun. So you could do like a Quizlet set if you want to practice some words or do something like that, but quizzes gives it that fun of who gets the best time and all of those. So I picked those particular applications, quizzes and Nearpod and Formative, because they all sync really nicely with Google Classroom. So when we're thinking like beyond Google Classroom, right? Like what are we doing to house everything in this one place? Like where else do we need to go to get that information that we need from students, whether it's for planning purposes or assessment purposes or both, or simply just to get to know them since we don't get to talk to them every day. Okay, let's have a little discussion moment. So we're gonna send you back to the Jamboard right now. So you might still have it open in a tab, or there's the link again. And we're gonna head over to the 4th frame here and do a little collaborative discussion activity. So the kind of big question that I've been thinking about is, how are these activities that I've used before and the decision process that I used before, like how do I translate that into the now? Because there's a whole new set of limitations and there's a whole new set of challenges, but that means there's a whole new set of opportunities. So what can I do to take that teacher thinking process that I've always used and make it work for the now? Because we're in the now, right? We're not in the before times anymore. So what I would like us to do now is to kind of think through what things in your instruction from the before times, think about your instruction in the before times, what things from your instruction do you want to keep, and what things need to change? So you're going to keep them, but they're going to look different now? And what things do you just need to dump? Because honestly, I have to dump a lot of stuff. A lot of the things that I really love to do as a teacher simply aren't going to work right now. Like most of my investigations that I do as a science teacher, I'm not going to be able to do. So I either have to dump them and find a replacement, or I have to change them to make them fit in my current now. So let's take a minute, grab some of those sticky notes and whatever color floats your boat, and add some notes to the keep and the change and the dump columns from your own personal thinking.
I love the ideas that we're seeing so far. And I think too, when we look at this, depending on what type of environment you're teaching in, if you're teaching in fully remote, a hybrid, all in person, or some other hodgepodge of a schedule right now, it's neat to see what people are continuing to use and to continuing to work through, and what we need to change. The peer editing one that popped up first had me thinking about, gosh, I don't know what environment that that member of our conversation today is teaching in, but that would be a difficult thing to do. If we're used to doing that in person and we're trading papers, how are we going to share our students' work with a peer to have them do a review on a classmate's writing? So if you have added something here, if you want to just unmute yourself and kind of explain what you meant by something that you're going to keep, change, or dump, we'd love to just kind of dig into this conversation a little bit more.
Thank you, Christy, for honoring that. I forgot to mention that those Post-its across the top there, the remote only, the hybrid, the all in person, or the other, right? Like the dreaded other, are just to honor the fact that we're all in really different situations that are changing a lot. So our keep, change, dump exercise could be a daily task for us right now.
The person who added traditional tests in the dump, that seems to just be such a big thing right now. We can't test the way that we always have tested, and that used to be, we teach and we assess, and we teach and we assess, and so dumping the traditional test is just something that has to occur right now. So we have to change the way that we're testing, and I love the examples, Laura, that you shared with your Flipgrid example. And the Ed puzzle, how genius is that to have the students kind of assess the teacher on what her errors were? I think that's so clever and could be adapted across subjects and grade levels. I mean, kids love doing that at all grade levels, to point out the word on the board that the teacher spelled wrong, or similar examples to that.
I love the sticky note that says expectations that everyone can do the same thing being dumped. I just think that speaks just so much to our current situation, right? I think traditionally that was what we would strive for, but I think realizing that we're, potentially in a hybrid environment, it almost forces the opportunity for more individualized support, and students might not learn things on the same day or in the same way, but if they learn it, that's kind of the end game. That's all we care about. So it's a tall order, but it's an absolute dump. I agree. I think that was Laura's sticky.
I think I tended to think of differentiation in terms of IEPs and specific needs. And so of course not everybody can always do the same thing, but that idea that we're all trying to get to the same end point, I think has just been blown open for me a little more, that I used to think like, oh yeah, a couple different paths is cool. And maybe that was just me being a little too controlling. And now we're seeing like, wow, there's way more paths than I imagined. And I'm getting a lot more okay with that than I thought I would have been. So it's good to check our expectations.
And I think the barriers that we're seeing now too are different. I mean, obviously they're different than we've ever seen before. The traditional barriers to learning in the classroom are still there, but we also have so many new additional barriers to students. Like you said, whiteboard Phi worked well, and you think maybe it didn't work well for those kids who either couldn't have multiple tabs open at the same time, or maybe their internet speed wasn't great. So gosh, those multitask barriers and internet speed barriers aren't something that we saw as much in our in-person, the before times.
Thanks, Jen. Jen just shared something in the chat and dumped the partner work for larger groups, so that there's less onus on each individual, because you never know when you're going to get kicked out. And then if you just have one partner, that leaves one person all alone. But if there's 4 people in a group and someone gets kicked out, A, that person doesn't feel as bad because they know they haven't left somebody behind, and B, the work still continues while they try to resolve their tech issues. So thanks for that. Even just a simple tweak from partner to group work can make a really big difference.
It's so interesting to see all of the things that you guys have popped on here, and to I think something that we're learning so much is just learning each other's perspectives. And when Laura shared some ideas with us, and through our discussion and planning this event, we all realized that, you know, we are having to obviously think outside the box, but things that we, for example, you know, using something like forms, where we, maybe in my head, I thought, okay, that's just purely something that we can only use for this one type of task. It's been neat to see a teacher who's using these tools every day, and to maybe pull that into a synchronous type of learning task, where before, you know, we just kind of saw it in one way. And I know, Laura, you spoke a little bit about all of these tools and how they all sync to Google Classroom. So that hasn't always been the case, but in most of these types of these sites and these programs, they now have built-in features to sync to your classroom. So where you maybe just share a link to your Padlet, that might be the case for some, but also a lot of times they can just totally sync with your classroom and pull in your whole class list. So students are not having to navigate multiple tabs. They just have to click from their house, from their Google Classroom, and it takes them to where they need to go, which is great. And so much of this is still evolving and being renovated as we move through this new type of learning.
All right, I think we have a few minutes left. I can cover the next section, which is just some Google Classroom updates and then some tips and tricks. So jumping back to our house analogy, this goes a little bit away from the heart of our session today, which was, you know, Laura's applications and how we enhance our house and do those renovations. But I think the updates and the tips and tricks are more so maybe, you know, we're putting a quick coat of paint on something, or maybe we're replacing our furnace to make our house more energy efficient. And these updates and tips are just allowing us to use our house in a more meaningful way and a more efficient way. So these updates have been out for a little bit, so you may already be familiar, but with our first update, just the way to invite students, and at this point, I'm sure we all have our students in our classes, but you know, there could be some adjustments going on. And so just to let you know that it's not just the normal way where you're adding students or you're sharing that that code, but you can actually grab that invite link and then, you know, throw it in your site or send it in an email. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility with how you actually invite students to your class. And then the next update, again, I'm sure you're using it every day when you use your Google Classroom. It's, you know, probably like using your kitchen every day in your house, but just that to review for teachers option and your to-do list for students has been added since August for both the student side and the teacher side, to allow for just a more concise view of, okay, what do I need to grade or what do I need to complete? And that's a great place to direct parents to ask their students, say, hey, you know, can you show me your to-do list? And then it's a nice way to, you know, see what's going on with the student, what they've completed. And then we're going to jump to just a couple of, yeah, that's just the student to-do piece. We're going to jump to some tips and tricks, just little things that you may probably are rocking and rolling with already. But for some reason, the Google Classroom site doesn't have you land on the classwork page. maybe that'll change in the future, but I think a lot of folks prefer to have their students actually go directly to that classwork page. So this is just an example of how you can actually grab the link to the classwork, the URL to the classwork page, and put that on your site, or however it is you communicate with students, so then it takes you directly there instead of that stream tab. The next tip would be to bookmark your classwork pages. So not just bookmarking classroom, but the actual, like that link to the classwork tab. And you could do it, for each of your hours or each of your subjects. And you could even create a folder for each of those bookmarks on your bookmark bar. So just, really quick, fast access to the classwork pages of your classroom. The next tip, again, you're probably familiar with this, the class comments piece that, you can navigate that throughout the stream, but if you want students to actually get notified, like, hey, the teacher or someone has notified or really pinpointed me in this specific comment, if you write a plus sign and then followed by their email, then it directly notifies them and says, hey, I'm talking to you. The next tip or trick is just a quick keyboard shortcut, Control F, which you can use that in kind of all areas of your life on the computer, but it also works in Google Classroom. You're looking for a specific, assignment name or student name, Control F, and it gets you directly to where you need to go. You might want to consider, if you haven't already done so, like moving forward beyond just this semester or this year, how you might want to set up a Google Classroom template for the future, so you're not having to reinvent the wheel or recreate your classroom every year, that you almost have like one class that is specific, that specific purpose is to be a template. You've got the organization and kind of the framework down for whatever you want your class to be, but it's not an actual live class. That's the class that you would duplicate every year to then build the actual class with kiddos. Just wanted to make sure everybody knows that the private comment feature is enabled in Google Classroom, so you can still have that one-way communication or two-way communication between student and teacher. So this might be a good workaround for, unfortunately can't do that with Meet quite yet anyway, but you can do that within Google Classroom, within the assignments. The student selector, this is available on the mobile app for Classroom, and it's available for both Android and iOS now. So if you go up to, if you're in your app and you go up to the top right, and there's like a little, I don't know, squiggly, you see that little icon right there, little squiggly icon, that's the student selector, and so it lets you basically choose students at random, and when it pops up, it allows you, it sees the student's name, but also you can select call later if maybe they don't know, or if they're absent, you can mark them absent, and then it like recycles the students. How to package your assignments. I know that Laura does this in her classroom, where she adds a lot of really specific information into the assignments, not just the name, but directions. And then I know a lot of folks are adding in like emojis and color to really kind of have those, the text pop a little bit and just be a little bit clearer. So lots of different creative ways in which you can package your assignments, like have everything they need in one place in one assignment. Next is the emojis that I mentioned that you can add in your assignments, but there is a Chrome extension called Emoji Keyboard if you want to add that to your Chrome, as well as an Emojipedia. If you're looking for a specific emotion, you can search that Emojipedia for just the right emoji. I know Bitmojis have been kind of all the rage lately, particularly creating a virtual Bitmoji classroom, but I did think this was a creative article that just kind of gave some examples of just different uses for a Bitmoji classroom. Like you can see the example of like creating a class photo with everybody's Bitmoji. So it's worth the read. I know that some people are a little bit, have Bitmoji fatigue, but you might want to take a glance at that if you haven't already. And I think we're up to our resources page. I'm always kind of building or curating lists of resources from, lots of great folks. So this is stuff, from Google for Education. This is stuff for like parent guides, student guides, and then also teacher resources. And then as always, you can access our 517 EdTech website on the next slide, as well as our video playlist and tweet out using the hashtag 517 EdTech. And I want to give a special thank you to Laura for giving up her time to share her awesome thought process and all of her creative ideas in which she's taking her Google Classroom house and renovating and patching that roof and all those fun things that you have to do as a teacher, but especially in this climate when there's that constant moving target these days. So thank you very much, Laura. We really appreciate your time and welcome you anytime to these sessions.
Thanks for having me.